We're going to take those three basic Mix EQ applications and break them down one by one and look at a couple of theoretical examples of where you would use these techniques while you're working on your mix. Again, I'm not going to do any mix context examples because I think it might be too confusing with all the other stuff going on. But again, once you learn the basics here, you'll want to try and apply those to the actual mixes that you're working on. We're going to start here with EQ Fix-It. And as I've mentioned before, with computer music, fix-it applications for EQ and mixing are rare, but not entirely uncommon. However, odds are where we are, and having made music in the computer and listened to the track over and over again, the fixing was probably done at some point during the creation. So if you have something that has a lot of built up low end or whatever, you're going to get rid of it early on because it's getting in your nerves and it's ruining the song and ruining your creative process. But that's not always going to be true in every mixing scenario. If somebody sends you stems and the person who's recorded it is maybe an inexperienced recording engineer, there may be some problems that you do have to go in and address. And then it's likely that those problems are going to be true all the way across the board. So if one recording hasn't really been done up to high quality standards and it needs some fixed EQ, they probably all are going to need some of that application. But with modern synths, stems from an artist or a creator, again, someone who's having to listen to their music again and again, professional sample packs, and multi-sampled instruments, usually the fix-it application has already been taken care of. And if anything, sometimes they take it a little bit too far and you have to kind of pull back on things a little bit. But rarely, if ever, are you going to have to go in with, let's say, a multi-sampled instrument like piano or strings and like high pass filter it, because chances are they've already done that and have tried to make the instrument sound as good as it possibly can. That way they'll be able to sell it a little bit easier. So one of the mixing myths that has quite a bit of credence is the high pass filter everything. And if you look at people in tutorials, especially for mixing dance music or music that's meant to be played in a club on a big system, you'll see that they have an EQ on almost every track. However, in many cases, the only thing that EQ is doing is applying a high pass filter. Now, the logic to that is that think about your low sound waves in general and low frequencies. Okay, low frequencies equals longer waves, and those longer waves are not absorbed as easily just in air or even through a lot of materials. They can just travel right through, right? If somebody's listening to music on a boombox and you're in a different room, you normally hear the low end of it. You're not hearing all of the detail up in the mid range or in the high range. And so the theory here, and it's a good theory, there's applications to it, is that if you're in a club and your music plays out and you haven't addressed the low end good enough, or you haven't really focused the low end for just the elements that are down there, specifically the kick drum, any kind of bass line, or any kind of sub element that you have, it can end up building up really quickly, and these waves don't absorb as easily. And so with a huge sub, it can build up and it can sound really bad. And that's where people say, it sounds muddy or crowded, or you lose clarity because those waves are larger. It then distorts what you're hearing in the upper range. And that's why music that's mixed specifically for clubs or, big speakers, whatever, tends to go more the direction of high pass everything as a precautionary fix it for down the road, because the system you have set up in your house isn't the same as the system that you have in a club. And so a little bit of buildup you're probably not going to notice at home, but that little bit of buildup in a club could really be amplified to another level. So what does this all mean? Well, it means for a lot of genres of music that aren't going to be played back on a large system, the high passing everything can actually do more harm than good. Because suddenly now, and a lot of people do this too, with their cutoff frequency and with the steepness of their slope, they'll put it too close to the fundamental of that sound, and then it actually brittles it out and it loses power, even if those things aren't conflicting with what's going on in the bass or in the sub. And so you just end up with something brittle and weak, which isn't the point here. The point is to fix something that could potentially cause a problem, or even is causing a problem that you can hear at the time. So if you want a high pass filter everything and you're working on dance music or club music, I'm not going to stop you, but at the same time, remember that you can't remove what isn't there. So use a frequency analyzer, check things. You don't need to just put on additional EQs and processors, which are taking up CPU space and in some way, impacting the sound. You don't just have to do it for the sake of doing it. Use that precious CPU space for something else. Other applications of fixed EQ are excessive hiss, and in that case, I'd probably use a pretty gentle, high shelf filter, which we don't have an example of, but I will show you and talk about. If you've ever worked with cables, you have sometimes wire buzz or hum. EQ Fix-It can sometimes address that to some degree, and also room modes or resonances. And this is if for some reason you've recorded, like let's say yourself playing a guitar through an amplifier in a box room, they're going to be standing waves. I mean, that's just an acoustic phenomena, meaning that certain notes are going to be amplified because they are vibrating with the room itself. You can't see it, but you can definitely feel it and hear it. And then some notes are going to almost disappear entirely. So you have these nodes and anti-nodes, and there's places of phase cancellation. We're not going to go into the details, but if you hear it, it's something that you can sometimes address with a fixed EQ, and we will look at an example of that in just a minute. So the question you have to ask now is, what EQ specifically do I want to use for fix-it applications? And the type of EQ is normally something surgical that colors the sound in the least according to your interpretation and opinion. Typically, you'll want to use the same EQ for all fix-it tasks you encounter in any individual mix. And really, you probably are going to end up using the same fix-it EQ for every single mix because it's what you're comfortable using and you like the way it sounds and the way it operates. So you'll want to make sure with your fix-it EQ that you have filters and shelves. So that's for things like rumble or for tape hiss or just an overly bright or overly dark sound. You can use those filters to fix things and shelves. Or if you're trying to fix a room mode or a resonant frequency, you'll probably want to have a combination of a spectrum analyzer, and within the EQ, you want to have a bell shape that gives you a variable Q so that if it's a really particular frequency that's just sticking out, you can make that Q really sharp, hone in on the frequency, and just take out what you need to take out. So with what we have available to us and what we looked at so far, the logical choice for us is going to be to use the TDR Nova. And so we're just going to look at two examples here. One example where a high-pass filter is going to come in very handy, and another example where we have a resonant frequency that is just peaking out of control that we want to tame a little bit if we're unable to, let's say, re-record the part. Always remember that in many situations, a bad recording is a bad recording no matter what you do to it. But in this first example, we have this cymbal smash sound. And to me, it sounds very good. I've got no complaints about that whatsoever. I can hear at the end of the sample, there's like a low thud that's a part of the sound. And if I look at my spectrum analyzer here, I'm going to see that that low thud and just in general, that there's a lot of energy happening in this sub-region in the low end where I wouldn't normally expect it to be for a sound of this nature. And let's get the right one. Okay, so we can see here if I've held out on this, that there's a lot of information, even up to like 150 hertz or so, that probably isn't adding a whole lot to this sound. If anything, this is just going to get in the way of whatever our bass line or whatever our kick drum is doing if it has a fundamental frequency in this area. And this is actually peaking out, not that high. You can hear it, but it's not a huge concern for most styles or genres of music. But what also is concerning me is the fact that I see information even below 20 hertz. So your speakers, they don't know that your hearing range is just 20 to 20. They're going to try to reproduce whatever they're given. Some speakers are better at this than others. But what this means is you want to actually take this into account and make sure that you're cutting off anything that's below the range of human hearing. That's not going to benefit your recording in any way at all. So I'm just going to grab the TDR Nova. This one also gives us an analyzer. And this analyzer goes all the way down to 10 hertz. And we can see that there's quite a bit of action going on down there. So I'm just going to grab a high pass filter. And personally, I like using slopes that aren't super steep and just going up higher. But that's just a personal preference. There's nothing wrong with going with a steep slope and not pushing the cutoff as high. So just as a review to you, if we go with a 12 dB per octave slope and I bring this up to say 50 hertz, what this means is that at 50 hertz, we're taking away 12 decibels. Okay. And then at 25 hertz, or the octave below this, we're taking away 24 decibels. And then at 12.5, we're taking away whatever. And just remember that because there's not that much signal in the low end anyway, we probably will be reducing it enough to the point where we aren't hearing it, especially if we take this up a little bit higher. So let's just listen to this and apply some of this high pass filter. So if I go up too high, I can really hear how it's changed the sound. So I want to take it just high enough to the point where I'm not hearing the effect of the filter on the main bulk of the sound, what's really giving it its character. So in this example, I feel I can almost take it up to 245 hertz. We're going to hear a big difference here, but the question is the other content, is it necessary to the sound in the mix that we're working on? If we look at the analyzer out, you can see just how big of a difference that made. And again, if we're listening louder, you would hear more of a difference to the sub that's taken away. But in my opinion, if I was working with this sound and I was concerned about space in the low end, I would probably push the filter all the way up to something like 245 hertz. That seems a little bit extreme. And if I wasn't worried about playback on, a really expansive subsystem, I'd probably pull this down to something in the range of 180 or 200. Again, set these things to taste, but this would be an example of a fix-it EQ. We got rid of the really, really low stuff. All of that rumble is gone, so we can focus on the main sound. In the second example, we're going to take a listen and look at what happens if you have a really resonant frequency that's just poking through and is quite obnoxious. So if we listen back to this. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. So this would be more an example where like the microphone, the preamp, or something on the mixing console has just gone haywire and has given us this really unpleasant, harsh, nasal, whatever adjective you want to use, sort of a sound. And if we look at the span in this example, an example of a very resonant frequency in a recording, we can see exactly where this resonant frequency is occurring, and it's happening here around 1.85K or so. And you're probably never going to have something this extreme, but even with like a room mode, you will see on the spectrum analyzer, things that are kind of poking out and don't look like they're really should be poking out like they are if it was just a natural sound. So again, we can fix this pretty easily going in with the TDR Nova, and we can hold Command and Shift to isolate a particular band. We can increase the Q to really focus it in and just go around and try to find where the problem is. With the analyzer, it gives us an extra cheat, but let's just go ahead and do an example. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example. So this sounds normal to me. Resonant frequency in a recording. Starting to hear something. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. So we can hear that that's kind of the place where things don't sound very good. So now I can just go in here and take a big cut out of this, or what I would call a natural cut. So I don't want to just eliminate the frequency entirely, but I want to try to bring it back into context with this voice as a whole, which is of course my voice. So an example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. And if I want, I can try to really fine tune this and really sharpen this cue even further. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. An example of a very resonant frequency in a recording. And when we look there at the analyzer out, we can actually then see how this display is a little bit more even across the board, which is what I'm looking for. I don't want to just eliminate this entirely because it's important to the voice, but I do want to bring it back under control so you can hear just how big of a difference that has. Now, in our case, in our purposes, we're probably not going to have to worry too much about tape hiss or any kind of wire or cable hum. But if you were to deal with wire or cable hum, you would do this process that I just showed you. With tape hiss, more likely what you're going to do is use a high shelf and just try to bring it down a little bit. You don't want to go in and go like extreme with it. It's just going to sound weird if you were to take a bell and do something along these lines. What I'd do is take a shelf and then try to really like smooth it out. So going to the left in this example, and then just taking out a couple of dB or so, or until it started to sound a little bit more natural to me, where we got rid of some of that hiss. There are better ways to remove hiss almost entirely from a signal, but we're not going to be going into those, and really this fixed EQ application can get the job done in many circumstances. So that's it for the fix it EQ application. In the next video, we're going to be talking about enhance it in the mix using an EQ.